Everybody. I'd like to do a new series. I don't know how many parts it'll be, but I feel very compelled by the Holy Spirit to tell you the story of Samson, the mighty bridegroom. And the first one is the first session I'm going to call Samson, the Philistine crisis. And I'm just going to read one verse from Judges chapter 13. It says, "And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Judges 13:1. Now the book of Judges is a divine record of the early years of the history of Israel as they took possession or failed to take possession of the promised land. Now it is a tedious and repetitious record consisting of a recurring cycle in which Israel initially relies on God in faith and sets out in battle against her enemies to take the land, and then she would prevail for a short season, possess the land, and eventually Israel would forget God and accommodate the paganism around her, make alliances, compromise, and then the cycle would turn to her coming under the domination of those very pagans that she accommodated. And that domination came to the point of varying degrees of slavery, degradation, and oppression. Then, at the bottom of the cycle, Israel would cry out to God for deliverance, and he would raise up for her a judge, a deliverer. That judge would lead a successful overthrow of the pagans and restore Israel's fortunes, throwing off the shackles and liberating the people, who would then serve God until they would forget him again, only to relive the same cycle of compromise, bondage, and oppression again, until they would again cry out to God for deliverance. Now, each time the cycle of Judges replayed itself, the oppression grew harsher, the bondage lasted longer, and the people's sufferings were greater. Israel endured the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Midianites, and Ishmaelites, and God raised up judges in every case to deliver them in turn. We have names like Othniel, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Barak, and others as well, through whom God wrought mighty deliverances. A very exciting book. But the final oppression of the book of Judges came at the hands of the Philistines. And it lasted longer than any other. And really, the danger of that final oppression was far greater to Israel for a number of factors. You see, by the time of the Philistine crisis, there was one factor which was lacking in that cycle, as we see in verse 1 of chapter 13. In all other cases, we saw that Israel groaned and suffered under the oppression until they just cried out to God in their anguish for relief. But there is no such outcry in the Philistine crisis. It's as though they had gotten used to oppression, or perhaps they were somewhat exhausted, that they were so exhausted that they were prepared to accommodate on some level to the quote-unquote superior Philistine culture in spite of the paganism within it. This is very relevant to much of the church today. She has gotten comfortable with the sheer weightiness of worldliness which presses down on our world and church today. There is little or no desire for deliverance from the paganism which inundates our society and even the churches. Judah, in particular, was living in a Philistine world and getting used to it. Too much. Perhaps the oppression was more humane. There is a chance that she saw the Philistine culture as superior to her own, and that Philistines could be reasonably accommodated. There was no cry out to God for deliverance, as in all the other earlier examples in Judges. The Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines, we're told. But to what end? He didn't do so that they might just cast aside the only true religion on earth and make peace and love with these pagans. The Lord didn't cast aside his plan to create a holy people through whom he would send a holy Messiah to crush the serpent's head, as it says in the book of Genesis, and to save the world. Then why did the Lord deliver his people into the hands of the Philistines? Well, he wanted to cure them of their tendency to idolatry by putting them under this people until they called out to him for deliverance, as in olden times, such as in the days of Gideon or Deborah. But Judah had gotten too comfortable under the Philistines. She found a way to live with them. She was enamored with their civilization and became submissive to these pagans. Perhaps there could be coexistence in spite of the forced subservience upon the Jews. But the Most High God himself would send Israel a deliverer, whether they wanted one or not, for he has his own agenda, which involved Israel and the Messiah, which he intended to send through Israel to redeem the world. Now, this is the backstory of Samson, the mighty bridegroom.